Before I start, thanks for inviting me to come to speak this morning. Hope you find the presentation interesting. I've tried to concentrate on where some of the money that the network companies use to innovate and develop and roll out smart grids comes from, and some of the challenges that have driven the network operators to use these new methods. I was cursing Frank earlier on because he was stealing some of my thunder a bit, but hopefully I've used different pictures. So just before I start, the distribution policy team, one of its main roles is regulating the network companies and making sure that they have the funding that they need to take energy from where it's generated, or either where it's generated or where it comes onto their network to the end user. Frank mentioned that the network or the energy system had been fairly stable for a fairly long time. He mentioned Peterhead Power Station, I think that's a picture of Hunterston. We're a big power station at one end, power transmitted across large bits of the country on transmission networks, distributed through distribution network to end customers or businesses. That's sort of traditionally the way the network's operated or worked for a very long time, and that's the way network companies, or that's what network companies were funded to deliver. More recently, new sources of generation are connecting to the network. New sources of generation such as wind, which aren't there all the time, as Frank mentioned. They're intermittent, which leads to challenges to the transmission network. Wind and solar energy connecting to the distribution network, leading to the changes in power flows that Frank mentioned. So instead of energy always going in at the top and being used at the bottom, you've got energy being connected at the distribution level and flowing back up the way. The ARC project that was mentioned is looking at aspects of that and the challenges that, or accelerating the connection of renewable connections, where renewable connections on the distribution network are being curtailed because there isn't the network capacity on the transmission network, and that project's looking at ways around that. Another challenge that's facing the networks is new sources of consumption, or new patterns of consumption, electric vehicles. I think the gentleman in the audience mentioned heat pumps earlier, placing new loads on the network. All these challenges were recognised by the regulator at the start of the last price control period, when we were undertaking the review for the last price control period, and we founded something called the Low Carbon Networks Fund about 5 years ago. That provided, because it's almost finished, £500 million worth of funding for DNOs, distribution network operators, over the 5 years. So the final second tier projects were funded last year. There was two parts to the project, to the LCN fund. There was a first tier which provided a small amount of money for licensees to go away and do research off their own back. Each licensee had an allowance. Frank can correct me if I'm wrong. Part of the battery on Shetland, I think, was funded through the Low Carbon Networks Fund. The first tier provided small amount of money for trial projects by licensees. The second tier is a competitive process where there was £64 million available each year for licensees to seek funding for larger flagship projects. Accelerating renewable connections is one of them. Nines wasn't. My Electric Avenue, which Frank mentioned as well, is another. All of these addressing challenges that the network companies face in terms of connecting new sources of demand and generation. The reason we introduced the Low Carbon Networks Fund and what's about to supersede it, the innovation stimulus, is that just as historically the network operated in one way, companies were also regulated in one way, and that was to drive down the cost of operating the network. So historically, licensees weren't really incentivised to do new things. They weren't able to gain a competitive advantage because the regulator set how much they could charge for the use of their network. And there was also an expectation that if one company did something new that led to savings for customers, the licensee wouldn't need to stump up for it because they would be funded at the next price control review period anyway. The level of funding that was provided for the low carbon networks, I wanted to nick a minute, was intended to provide enough for large flagship projects that would deliver significant value for customers, and also to leverage funding from other sources. So partners on innovation projects such as British Gas and some of the big suppliers, as well as some of the big technology companies like Siemens and ABB. We also included a successful delivery reward to try and mimic the benefits that companies that operate in a market get from innovating. So as part of the competition, licensees need to provide at least 10% of the funding, and the customer, through use of system charges, provides at least the other 90% or up to the other 90%. Following the project, the licensees can seek to get that extra 10% back as a reward if they run the project efficiently. Throughout DPCR5, a number of innovations were developed. They weren't necessarily invented or new at the start or during DPCR5, such as automated voltage control, dynamic line rating. I'll pick on that one just now. At the start of DPCR5, we had dynamic line rating, but there was perhaps a winter rating and a summer rating. That's become more nuanced as development innovation projects have gone on. Network companies were needing to put in new overhead lines and new capacity to connect wind farms, for example. Somebody had the bright idea that when it's windy and the wind farm's generating, the wind's cooling down the cables, so you can probably put more electricity through the cables. And there's a number of innovation projects looking at that. We've talked about poles already. Frank mentioned the steel outer for the poles from Australia. One of the other companies, I think it might be an SSE as well, actually developed composite poles instead of wooden poles, which can last longer. Other things that companies are looking at is working on tree felling while lines are live rather than switching off lines, which means that there's more security of supply and customers are off for less time. Other things that are getting more advanced is the modelling and forecasting of customer data. Historically, it was all done on assumptions about people going and turning the kettle on at half time in the football or the interval in Coronation Street, whereas now there's far more monitoring on the low voltage network and real data available for network operators and planners to use. Funded these innovations through the Low Carbon Networks Fund, and will continue to fund innovation for a number of years during the next price control period through Network Innovation Competition and Network Innovation Allowance, which supersedes and build upon the Low Carbon Networks Fund. The new price control period starts on the 1st of April this year. It's called REAL-ED1. And we're expecting licensees to deliver the benefits of the innovation that they've delivered during DPCR5 in the REAL-ED1 period, and we're expecting that to begin from the beginning. As part of their submissions, licensees incorporated the benefits of smart grids into their business plans when they were sort of coming looking for the money for the next period, as it were. We've sort of taken more off that, and smart grids, as a result of previous innovations, delivering about £800 million worth of benefit across GB in terms of reduction in duos or use of system charges, in the next price control period. As learnings developed through innovation projects, we expect it to be incorporated into business as usual, and licensees are incentivised to do that in a number of ways, through a sharing mechanism, where if company is funded £100 million to do something and it only costs 50 million, the difference is shared between the licensee and the customer. So customers benefit and the licensee benefits as well. It's incentivised to sort of deliver benefits for customers. This should encourage the connection of new low carbon technologies and new sources of generation. Where licensees aren't financially incentivised to roll something out during the price control period, as part of the next price control mechanism that starts on the 1st of April, we've introduced something called the innovation rollout mechanism. So where a licensee develops something new, they've not been funded to roll it out during the price control, they can come to us at 2 windows during the next price control period and say, we've developed this widget, it delivers carbon or environmental savings, but we can't afford to roll it out under the allowance that we've already got. Please can we have some more money, please? And we'll look at their submission and make a decision as to whether or not it's in the best interest of customers, and may or may not allow the licensee to sort of take additional funding from customers to roll out.